sustainability depends upon social arrangements, not just technology. Just to say something about how I'm going to do this, what I've done is brought together a lot of text by a lot of different authors, so it's not going to just be my voice, but on the other hand, I feel that speaking from a commons point of view, that doesn't really impinge on things. It's just because they're saying things more neatly and more clearly in more time than I've had to really gather this stuff. So I'm from a group called Commons Rising that is trying to just generally make or create a situation where people get to be more aware of the commons. And in fact, today is one of our events in London called Commons Taster at Goldsmiths. Breaking the Frame sees the issue of technology coming up in a variety of different struggles, from freedom of the internet to reproductive technology to the structure of the workplace, lots of other situations we've been talking about it this weekend. And it also asserts that unless the form of technology is itself changed, real democracy won't be achieved. And the question has then become, how will these separate struggles realize their shared purpose, and how can technology be changed? Those are sort of questions that seem to have sort of come up again and again for me in listening to the debates. And so I would like to share with you how I feel that maybe the Commons can help in these debates. However, I think the first thing to look at is the kind of invisibility of the Commons. It's usually not seen until it's lost. And then it becomes visible. So, when the CEO of Nestle announced that water was a commodity, people were really shocked by that. And that, I think a kind of line was drawn under things when that was said, and people reacted very strongly. Similarly, when people of Scotland learned that the Coolin Hills were up for sale, the land movement really took off, and which generally went in hand with an increased awareness of who owned the land, which went hand in hand with the growth of the democracy movement in Scotland. So it tends to be invisible till sort of the enclosure begins to happen. People are aware of the land grabs going on in Africa, maybe, and the carve-up of the internet by giant corporations. But I would say that, and I'm not talking about people in this room, because obviously people are extremely well read and thought a lot of them deeply about these things, but I would say that on the whole, people in the UK have gotten just no concept that they've had the commons ripped out of them in every single, they've been dispossessed, they've been plundered. And people simply don't have a sense of it. They don't have a sense that they're living, that just like it's happening in Africa, that is what has happened to our society. We're operating in a plundered and dispossessed culture. I mean, just to give one little baby statistic, that 0.6% of people own 60% of the land. And that matters, and 35% of the land isn't registered. And it really psychologically matters when land ownership is so skewed like that. It's kind of like you don't know where you begin and end. It's like you can walk over Buckinghamshire and I just don't know who owns what am I treading on? I've got no idea. And I'm walking through a footpath, what's this? It's a kind of like it's robbing you of, I mean, compare the say to the Native American Indian living prior to, they knew where they were. They knew they were living in a shared communal landscape in which they maybe were nomadic or whatever, but they knew where they were. I don't think we do, and it's this kind of alienation I want to discuss before moving on to how we might consider, because I think the alienation is so deep that it's very difficult to really conceive of what a commons-based society would be like. And that's, I think, is part of the problem, because we just see it within the framework of where we're at now, understandably. So this is something by Ugo Mattei, who says that the commons disappear as a result of their structural incompatibility with the deepest aspects of Western idea of legality. A legality that's founded on the idea of the individual as a primary kind of subject for law, and with the dichotomy between the state and private property. And so that's the first kind of beginning to disappear of the commons. The commons are squeezed out and has no legal status. Areas that support subsistence economies are regarded as economically non-existent, and so the vernacular law and customs-based stewardship of the land is replaced by ownership in the name of progress and efficiency. And Rose talked about this at some length in some workshops I was in. Enclosures in the 18th and 19th century, by the way, they started early in the 15th, but I haven't got time to go into all the history of enclosures, but that was a violent recruitment of dispossessed peasants to become the capitalist workforce. Some never even got into the workforce, so there's this huge vagrant population in those times, which kind of, what's the history of that? I don't know. We don't even really know much about the history of civil society in the 19th century. The history of friendly societies is still very underwritten. So a lot of these things, the anger about it isn't really there because the history isn't there. And I would say one of the aspects of capitalism, it doesn't like history. We prefer to live in a glowing future or a sort of something, but it certainly doesn't want to recognise the roots of its how it got there. And I think what the Grammache says here is very important, that dispossession wouldn't have occurred without a fundamental alliance between private ownership and the state. And I think that's another very important thing to get. It's not just landowners, this is all voted through numerous acts of parliament. So this merging between the state and private ownership happened a long time before the neoliberalism. It's not just the capture by corporations now of the state. This is historical. So we ended up really, I think, in a very false political discussion whereby the political discourse became sort of like between should the state do this or should private property do it? And it hid a shared structure of property, the market, and the sovereignty state based on a concentration of power. So private structures, corporations concentrate their decision-making and powers of exclusion in the hands of one subject or within a hierarchy. And you have a CEO at the top. Public structures are similarly very vertical and very controlled by small elites. And so what I want to look at next is just the structure of the market. And I think it's interesting to compare it with how we think of technology, because it's treated as though it's an active subject with its own agency. So it's quite common to hear that the market makes decisions, it prefers things, it punishes certain actions, it becomes nervous or it becomes bold or loses trust or acts cautiously. And our actions take place within the directions of this market. And that has become a naturalized state of being for us. That's normative, that's second nature. And then the political choice then comes between restricting the effects of the market to obtain social goals, or the opposite idea, the fantasy of a free market, in inverted commas, that will make everyone better off if they all pursue their own material self-interest. And while passing over the illusory nature of the free market idea for the moment, from this point of view, a centrally planned economy is nothing more than a radical variant of guiding a market. The market remains as a naturalized way to live, a kind of second nature, in a way, a kind of neutral force. So Karl Polanyi, maybe I've mispronounced it. Instead of the economy being embedded in social relations are embedded in the economic system. The market remains unquestioned in the same position of dominating social relations. Now, what is very different about the commons is not a market, and the market is not the commons. And there are far more serious differences between the commons and the market than there is between any kind of political left and right. And as my own feeling of where I think about this, I think I'm kind of glad the election went its way. I'd like to see the end of the Labour Party. I'd like to see a re-envisioning of what the left is, and I think it's got to be re-envisioned around a far more fundamental split than it's been positioned before. And David Harvey puts it as follows. I think you all know who David Harvey is, actually. At the heart of the practice of commoning lies the principle that the relation between the social group and that aspect of the environment being treated as a commons. Although, of course, the commons can be a lot more than just a question of environment. It can be in digital commons or knowledge commons. That it should be collective and non-commodified, off limits to the logic of the market exchange and market valuations. Right, so I wanted to make a comparison here between the logic of the commons and the logic of the market. I just going to quote, before I run into that, there's a nice paragraph by Ugamate again, which I think encapsulates a lot of it. The dominant worldview is substantially social Darwinism, which makes competition, struggle, and emulation between physical and legal persons the essence of reality. The recessive worldview, an ecological and holistic understanding of the world, is based on relationships, cooperation, and community. This model is still present in the organisation of communities in the periphery. I should say that like 2 billion people in the world live in subsistence economies based on commons principles. Continues to suffer merciless assault by the structural adjustment and comprehensive modernisation and development plans of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. There's many analyses in this. Such efforts encourage the commodification of land and of local knowledge, as well as cultural adjustments, imposition of human rights, rule of law, gender equality that serves a justifying rhetoric for continuity and plunder. I could talk more about all that. There's a very interesting article by Monbiot on colonialism and the kind of built-in insensitivity that was created by that moment in our culture. This is a very shorthand description of the core beliefs behind the market and the commons. So in terms of resources, scarcity is created or given, and it's created through barriers and exclusions, fences of patents, whatever you want to think about it. In the commons paradigm, for rivalrous resources, there is enough for all through sharing, or at least it's made fair how that sharing is done. For non-rival resources, there is abundance. The strategy of resources, efficient resource allocation. The strategy for the commons paradigm is strengthening social relations is decisive for ensuring fair shares and sustainable use of resources. The idea of the individual, for that of the market, is that the individual maximises benefits for themselves. Phrase I hope is familiar with homus economicus. The commons paradigm is that human beings are primarily cooperative social beings. The for-profit program is separation for human relationships, nature and other humans, the idea of separation, either or, individualism versus collectivism, human society versus nature, a lot of binaries. Within the commons paradigm is the idea of interrelationality. Individuals and collectives are nested within each other and mutually reinforcing. The kind of agents for change in the for-profit paradigm are powerful political lobbies, interest groups, institutionalised politics focused on government, which is where there's been a lot of kind of despair, I would almost say, about how we can affect these kind of change agents. Whereas in the commons paradigm, diverse communities working as distributed networks with solutions coming from the margins. And I'll talk about this later, but the way the commons deals with conflict and with diverse choices is just much more complicated and actually much more effective in the long term. The for-profit is concerned about market exchange, GDP, and is achieved through individual initiative, innovation and efficiency, whereas the commons is interested in use value, commonwealth, sustainable livelihoods and complementary enterprise. I mean, there are more things here, I would say, but I think one I just particularly want to talk about is just quickly about social relations. The for-profit heads towards centralisation and monopoly, commons for decentralisation and collaboration. Property relations, capitalism is based on ownership, exclusiveness, private property. I can do what I want with what is mine. Whereas property in terms of the commons is I'm co-responsible for what I co-use, and it's a question of stewardship. For profit talks about limited access and rules defined by the owner. The commons has, this is access to rivalrous resources like land or water or forest, whereas the commons might have limited access, but the rules are defined by users. So it's a very different sort of situation, where the access to non-rival resources, the approach of the for-profit idea is of limited access and creating scarcity artificially through law and technology. Whereas the commons approach is to have unlimited access to non-rival resources and open access as the default position. Use rights are granted by the owner. In the one situation, they're co-decided by co-producing users with fairness and access for all in the other. And about the way that the society that emerges is always stuck between an individual appropriation versus collective interests. Whereas one of the core concepts of the commons is Ubuntu, which is my personal unfolding as a condition for the development of others and vice versa. And the emancipation there's emancipation through convivial connections. So that's just to describe the kind of difference in the core beliefs underlying the systems. It's not covering all of them by any means. I just want to talk briefly about the kind of consequences of that, which, from a commons point of view, what the kind of person is that Homo economicus ends up. They end up as isolated. And people that may be covered over by a lot of things, but it's only by trading on the market they become social creatures. Isolated individuals submit to an anonymous power that is not their own by joining it and internalising its logic. They then have the opportunity to create and conform their individuality by means of consumption. And because consumption doesn't create true communality, as many people feel isolated even in a group, the only way out of this is more consumption. And that fits in, obviously, with the idea of what that suits produces. There's also the idea of structural exclusion. In markets, cooperation has the bitter flavour of competition. We cooperate so that we can hold our ground better in competitive situations. Any cooperation on one side implies exclusion on the other. One company's success is another company's failure. One person's success in applying for a job means rejection of all the other candidates. One person's green card means another person's deportation. It's this aspect of markets which you can call structural exclusion. Whatever doesn't make money falls between the cracks. And there's another aspect to it, structural irresponsibility. Isolation and separateness in the markets means that we cannot grasp the consequences of a purchase, which is one of the fundamental ways we engage in capitalism, is by buying things. So, for example, although there might be extremely inhumane conditions to extract coltan from which tantalum is used for producing cell phones, but what do we do without cell phones? There's a kind of a built-in information asymmetry where we simply don't know what we're buying a lot of the time. Short of massive boycotts or public organising, consumer purchases cannot alter the labour conditions and environmental effects of production. In this respect, money is extremely poor means of communication. These are just some of the aspects which we can contrast with the commons. Here, people are connected to one another. They use common resources and devise rules to sustain or increase them and find the social forms that fit best. The starting point is always the needs of the people involved, and those needs may be never the same. In a commons, the implicit model of humanity is not about individuals' abstract equality, but their concrete uniqueness. People participate actively in the commons process with their individuality, and if both the resources and the products are different and the people involved remain as they are, different individuals, then there are no uniform rules. But this isn't a problem in the commons, because in contrast to the market, the rules of the commons are made by the commoners themselves, and that's a really important difference. It's one of Eleanor Ostrom's main points.
Sorry, it's kind of close to time.
Okay, I'm getting nowhere near it then. Okay, well, I'm just going to mention just 5 things then about maybe how to create the transition. First is by gaining direct experience of being a commoner through some of the things we've heard about in the workshops: food sharing, lift shares, permaculture, guerrilla gardening, self-built housing, community land trust, peer-to-peer exchange, sharing schemes of lawnmowers and tools or rooms, local currencies like the Brixton Pound, time banking schemes, transition town networks. There's a vast economy growing, which is based on not-for-profit, and it's the fastest sector growing in the UK. So I think to have direct experience of commoning in some ways is to start to feel it, to get involved in it. The second is to establish a commons governance as a norm for all forms of activities that humans do in groups, from corporations to transition towns. And I haven't got the time now, but Eleanor Ostrom shows a number of governance principles which involve basically people making the rules, access to the rule making, and so forth like this. So I don't have time to talk about it now. Then there is about establishing a relationship between the commons and the state, and this requires inscribing the commons into law, which means altering the legal framework fundamentally, since it doesn't actually frame the commons. Again, this is a huge topic. It's been written by a number of people. It also applies to how you control the environment, and there are ideas now that, for example, Mother Nature should be a legal personality which is represented by human beings. So there are different sort of ideas of law. They're really very different constructions. There should be the idea of protecting the commons so that they can operate in a quasi-sovereign manner, similar to the market, but escaping the centralised mandates of the state and the logic of the market, while mobilising decentralised participation on the ground. And I think I'm... yeah. And I think I just mentioned this author. It's a very, very, I think perhaps over-optimistic idea of how technology can work for society, but it's worth looking at the ideas of Jeremy Rifkin and the Zero Marginal Cost Society, subtitled The Internet of Things, the Collaborative Commons and the Eclipse of Capitalism. And there are some things in there which do point really to a situation in which there is a zeitgeist change happening, and we're in the middle of it, and we don't really realise where we are in it. And it's very difficult from this point to understand what's going on, but he does put in a lot of pointers that show that because there are changes happening in the communications network, in the logistics network, and in the energy network, because these things are all happening. Whenever these things have changed in the past, like with windmills and printing presses and different forms of carriages and transport and roads and things, whenever these things have happened, you get mammoth changes in society, and so you actually move towards a different consciousness of what that society is. And what Rifkin is saying is, in the end, what glues society together is not the force by the status quo, but by the overall paradigm that people, in many senses, unconsciously subscribe to. So in the Middle Ages, that would have been the kind of hierarchical thing descending from God through the ruler down to the peasant. And we've gone through a huge change, very crudely now, of individualism, whatever, with capitalism. We're going into something much more participatory in sharing as a definition and a worldview. And it's... Rifkin is very optimistic about it. We may not be, but it's worth having a look.
Great.
Anyway,
Thanks very much.